Welcome to the EW podcast. I'm your host, Eric White, and today I have the pleasure of being joined once again by Dr. Edward Watts. Thanks for joining me, Dr. Watts.
Thank you, Eric. I'm so excited to be back.
Just a quick bio of you. You're the chair of the history department at the University of California, San Diego, and you've written a number of books. Last time you were on the podcast, we used your book, Mortal Republic, How Rome Fell Into Tyranny, as the framework for our discussion. And you have an upcoming book called The Eternal Decline and Fall of Rome, which we'll get you back on here once that's closer to the release date in August, right?
Yep. Yeah.
What does that book focus on?
So that book is focused on how we talk about change, and in particular, how there are positive and negative ways to talk about how a society is changing, and in particular, talking about problems that a society faces. And there's a real danger when we use this idea of decline to identify people who are responsible for it and victimize them, to do things to them because you've assigned blame to them for social conditions or political conditions or military conditions or public health conditions that seem to have negative consequences for the society. And what politicians do across Roman history, the book covers 2,200 years from basically the turn of the third century BC through now. Repeatedly across that time, people use this idea of Roman decline to identify people who are responsible in the view of a politician for causing a problem. And then they take away their rights, or they take away their property, or they take away their liberty as a way to pretend to address the decline. But what we also see across Roman history is a way of looking at decline without identifying people who are responsible for it and without creating victims. And instead, you can look at a social problem and say, society needs to come together to fix this. We don't divide society into people who are responsible for causing the problem and people who are responsible for fixing it. But we say, in essence, we all need to come together to fix this problem. And the idea of using decline to create victims divides society. But the idea of creating a collaborative effort to fix decline brings society together. And so this rhetoric can be really destructive, but it can also be really constructive. And so the book is an analysis of how across these 2,300 years, we see this rhetoric of decline leading to wars, leading to executions, leading to confiscations of property. But we also see it as an energizing force to make society better and to make society come together in a way where it becomes stronger and the bonds between people become stronger. And it's really our choice how we think about change and how we think about responding to it. We can choose to identify responsible parties and make them victims, or we can choose to all come together to fix things collectively. And so the book really is, I think, laying out the obligation that we have as a society to make those choices with a full awareness of what those choices entail and what it means for all of us if we make the wrong choice.
That seems extremely relevant to American society today. That the key seems to me, from your brief just summary there, the willingness of the would-be victims to enter dialogue reasonably, right? I mean, it's all about reasonable dialogue and collaboration as opposed to a defensive stance by either side.
Yeah, and I think what we see in Roman history is the victims don't often get a choice. You'll have a politician who will come in and say, our society is suffering from bad morals. And in the third century, early second century BC, you have politicians who come in and say, Roman society is suffering from bad morals because of Greeks. And the Greeks don't have a choice of, do we accept that or not? But what you get are laws that try to kick Greeks out of the city of Rome, laws that try to punish Greeks for being there, laws that try to restrict like Greek doctors or Greek philosophers from teaching in Rome. The choice that's made there is by the Romans. But there's another way to do this. There is instead a way of saying, in that case, for example, Greek philosophy teaches morality. Why don't we figure out how to come together to create a hybridized philosophy that is in Latin and is sort of true to Roman traditions and Roman ideas of governance, but incorporates the best parts of the Greek ideas. And that's what Rome eventually gets to. In the first century BC, all of the famous Roman thinkers that we know about, I mean, Cicero, Brutus, these are Sextus, these are people who are bringing in Greek ideas and translating them into Latin and translating them into a Roman context. And that's a positive way to move, to collaborate, to move Roman society in a new direction. And the politicians like Cato the Elder who choose to demagogue against Greeks, they're making a choice to create victims. But there is another choice, which is to collaborate to fix whatever problem one sees as dominating Roman society at that time. And I think that's a choice that in the 21st century in the US, we could make either kind of choice. I mean, we could make a choice that in this moment of public health crisis and political crisis, we identify people who we claim are responsible for it and we punish them. Or we could say this is a moment of crisis and we need to find a way to come together so that we work collectively to fix all of the things that have gone wrong.
Yeah. I'm very excited to read that. I'm avoiding chasing you down the rabbit hole of more questions on this because we have limited time and so much to talk about. But I'm very much looking forward to reading that and discussing it with you. But yeah, let's get into the topic for today. We'll put that
Sounds
one on
good.
ice. Yeah. So last time we talked, it was before the 2020 election. And as mentioned before, we were using your book, Mortal Republic, to frame the conversation and look at basically the question of, is America in a fall of Rome kind of moment? I had a great time in that chat. It's still one of the top episodes. So people seem to be interested in this kind of content. So I want to do a sort of follow-up to that conversation. A lot has happened in the 6 months since we talked in October. It's felt like 10 years almost. So one of the main takeaways for me and probably for many listeners from that conversation was that if we care about the health of our republic, our country, our system, we have to take political violence very, very seriously. We can't take it lightly. And January 6th happened.
Yeah.
And we all got to watch live as political violence entered the Capitol and things seem to be spiraling out of control. Luckily, for now, that seems to be kind of a peak event in this moment. Yeah. But I wonder what was going through your mind as you were watching those events or reading the news? How were you thinking about it?
It's terrifying. I mean, it's absolutely terrifying.
Do you say that as an American citizen or a Rome historian or both?
Both.
Yeah.
Both. I think one of the curses of being a historian is you have lots of stories where you can see the ending. You have lots of examples from the past that don't exactly parallel what's going on, but they give you enough of a sense that things are bad, that this is a very bad direction to go along. And it doesn't mean we have the outcome that you saw in Rome. It doesn't mean you have the outcome that you see in other societies. But the examples of societies that have events like January 6th and come back from them are a lot less common than the examples of societies that have events like January 6th and don't. And that's why I'm scared. Because what tends to happen is political violence is a technology. It's a political technology. And once it's introduced into the system, if it's not immediately purged, if it's not immediately disavowed, if it's not immediately destroyed, people realize that this is something that can be part of a political negotiation. It can be part of a political dialogue. And they learn how to do it better. And so once this gets into the system, it's there. It has to be stamped out, and it's very, very hard to stamp out. But I think what we see with January 6th is, this is in our system now. And what do we do to get it out of our system? How do we stop this? Because the thing that Rome shows in particular is political violence is something that people don't want to be a part of political discourse. But once that technology is there, politicians know they can use it. They also know they can't use it all the time. And the general populace in Rome, when political violence would erupt, they would decry it. They would get very angry about it. The people responsible for it would build, in one case, one of them builds a temple to Concord, to symbolize Romans coming together after the horror of political violence. He doesn't disavow doing it. He just says we need to come together afterwards and forget about it. And the Roman populace is willing to do that, because it's so horrible. They don't want to acknowledge that this is something that will have long-term implications. And in Rome, what happens is political violence breaks out. It gets resolved, however it gets resolved. And Romans then basically say, wow, okay, let's exhale, right? We escaped that crisis. And then political violence might not come back for another generation.
Wow.
But it's there. That technology is there. And people know how to use it, and they think about what went right and what went wrong, and they think about how to use it better. And what I worry about with January 6th is I don't know that we're doing as good a job as we could of stamping this out and saying that everybody in our society has to say that was wrong. Beginning to end, that was wrong. It cannot be done again. It cannot happen again. It's extremely dangerous for us to even entertain the fact that there's a legitimate way that violence can be used in our politics. And I don't feel like we're doing that. I don't feel like anybody is doing that. I feel like we're doing what Romans did and saying, okay, that could have been much worse. We escaped something that was horrible.
Yeah, I guess I just did that.
Well, I mean, it's a normal thing. It's a very traumatic event, and we don't want to think about it. We don't want to stare straight in the face of what that was. And that's a natural human reaction. And Romans had that reaction. And we can understand why they did. But I think the path that we see in Rome is that reaction, in a sense, prevents a reckoning with the fact that this technology has now not only been invented, but been utilized. And somebody's going to figure out how to do it better.
Why? I guess I'm not really clear why you keep referring to it as a technology. Is it because once it's generated, there's a desire to innovate with it? Is that the connection?
Yeah. I think that, it's a clumsy metaphor, I think, but it's still, I think, the best one I can come up with. In the Greek world, you have, in Athenian democracy and in the context of 5th century democracy, you have this invention of a kind of persuasive rhetoric. That's a tool. It's a political tool. And Athenians get better and better at using it. And then you have very cynical utilizations of it as you get through the 5th century, where you have teachers who say, I can teach you to persuade people about anything. And they give demonstrations where they, on the one hand, will give a speech that argues one side of a point and be totally persuasive. And then they will give a speech that argues the opposite side of the point and be totally persuasive. It's a technology for persuasion. And I think what violence in a political system represents is not a technology for persuasion so much as a technology of intimidation, a technology that limits debate, that makes persuasion unnecessary. And if it's used clumsily, it doesn't work very well. But there are ways to use it with more and more sophistication. And what you see in Rome is the first time people use intimidation, it's very clumsy. When Tiberius Gracchus is using this in the 130s, it's a very clumsy tool. It's really like walking around with big guys who look kind of scary and hoping that gets people to make a decision that you want them to make. Eventually it descends into organized sort of gang violence.
Yeah, I was trying to remember the example from your book where a politician and his followers beat up and they killed a bunch of people at some political gathering. Is that right? That was Gracchus and his school?
Yeah, Tiberius Gracchus uses just sort of scary guys to say like, hey, guess what? Like vote in the way I want you to, and my guys aren't going to rough you up. He never says it; it's always implied. When he's murdered, it's a mob of opponents who basically take things the next step, and say, "Well, you can use intimidation, but we're scared that it's not going to just be intimidation. We're scared that you're going to ramp this up to actually kill people, and so we are going to kill you first, so that doesn't happen." And as we move through the later Republic, what we see are people get better and better at combining the nuance of threat and violence, so that they don't get to the point where people say that's so beyond the pale that you must be removed from the political space. Instead, it's a combination of how do you use intimidation? How do you use low level violence? How do you not get to the point where people are going to say, this is beyond and it's not acceptable, it doesn't belong? And once you have something that gets into the system and people say, well, that was bad, but maybe we can understand it as these people kind of overreacting, or maybe we can rationalize this away.
Yeah, it's like getting into a cold pool bit by bit, right? You put one foot in, it's really cold, but you start to adjust, and then you get in a little deeper, and before you know it, you're up over your shoulders.
Yeah. And that's what I'm concerned about is I don't know how in a contemporary context you learn from January 6th about how to use this energizing of crowds. I hope that people can't learn from it. I hope that we purge this from our system completely and no one tries to do anything like that again. But I'm afraid that won't be the case. And that's what January 6th, that's why it terrified me. I think it's possible to turn back, but it's hard.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't remember. There was an AOC tweeted something. I can't remember if it was after or before January 6th, but was tweeting in support of the creation of lists of everyone who ever supported Trump and asking people to submit these names. And it's like, whoa, 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 whoa. I don't know. I can't remember when that was published, but.
And I think that the real risk there is because violence is now in the system. That kind of thing means something different. I think that's the other aspect of January 6th, where, if you have a system that is wholly about persuasion, lists of people don't mean the same thing as they do when violence is involved. And then it gets scary. It gets really scary.
Was Gracchus the main event that sprang forth in your mind when watching this? Is that the most relatable or most relevant comparison point from Roman history?
The one that actually jumped out to me is one that's not particularly well known, and it involves a guy named Saturninus, he and an ally were standing for election, and they actually do mobilize a vote when it's clear that they're going to lose. They mobilize a mob to disrupt the vote. And then they actually literally go up to the voting takes place on a low lying ground in the city of Rome, and they disrupt the vote. And then they go up literally to the Capitoline Hill. Like they literally go to the Capitol.
Wow.
And so that one jumped out at me because it's just so symmetrical.
Yeah.
I mean, the level of violence there, they actually kill the guy who's standing for election. So the level of violence there is far beyond what we actually had on January 6th. But then when we look at some of the stuff that it sounds like people might have been thinking they would do on January 6th, it's actually not that different. The whole some of the stuff that you hear about, they wanted to go after Mike Pence or they wanted to go after Pelosi. That's actually not so far different from what these guys were up to. But that was the one that jumped out at me. The fact that in Rome, you actually did have this kind of let's disrupt the vote and then let's go to the Capitol. I mean, it really is that's very symmetrical. It's not the same, but it's evocative.
Let's put a pin in that. I want to come back to that. certainly I have another follow-up question to that, but I'm just out of curiosity and can just be brief about this. Whenever you see major news stories like January 6th, this is just about how you think. Do you automatically go into your historian brain and start looking through the catalog of stories to see if anything lines up? Is that just an automatic thing for you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the past it's a set of tools to think with. I mean, I think that every historian would acknowledge that the present is different from the past, and what's happening now is not going to be the same as what happened in the past. But we also need to expand our imagination of what's possibly going to happen as a result of what events just unfolded. And so, as a historian, what I tend to do is say, I don't understand this. I mean, I've never seen anything like this. What kinds of examples of similar things can I think about where I can get a sense of the range of possibilities? What might this mean? Not what does this mean, because the past doesn't tell us what does it mean, but it allows us to say, here's what it might mean, and here's some other thing that it might mean, and here are some paths that we could go that will change outcomes or that might change outcomes. And so that's kind of, as a historian, I'm always sort of thinking both in terms of what I know and what I would explain to my students. Because the thing that is really clear to me is my students they don't really care that I unfold the world to them like an oracle. They don't like that. They don't want that. They don't need that. But what they do want is information to make their own decisions. And they want as much information as they can get because they're young and they're trying to figure out how the world works. And they're trying to figure out how, what sense of possibilities there are for what can happen in response to the events that are unfolding that they've never seen before. And so I always try to have that inner dialogue where I think about how I would explain something from the past as a possibility that students should consider. And so I think that might be how I would frame my pattern of thought. I see things, I try to figure out what are some possible analogs that can help us understand what's happening now. And then not treat them as gospel, not treat them as predictive, but treat them as tools to try to analyze the present and both see what's similar, but also see what's different, and also see what's possible, what futures are possible, and what we can do to try to get to one that seems better versus one that seems worse.
Yeah. This is maybe a little off color, but I enjoy occasionally sports betting, and this reminds me a little bit of that, where you're looking at a team's performance the season before. How did they perform on against teams in their division when they were away, and so you use that to make an educated guess about what the outcome will be for the upcoming event. So, just a random analogy.
I think if you follow baseball and you follow the sabermatic approach to it, there's very sophisticated ways to predict career outcomes for people, and they tend to be good unless something crazy happens, right? Like you can chart the percentage chance that, let's just say, Mike Trout is going to end up with 500 home runs in his career.
Mm-hmm.
And there are ways to do that. But if Mike Trout got struck by lightning, he wouldn't get 500 home runs.
Yeah.
And so you're always working in this sphere of like, what's likely, but there's nothing that's guaranteed. There's always something crazy that can happen. And I think a historian, there are obviously far more outcomes in history than there are in a baseball game. But we just try to understand what are possible outcomes here, what are likely outcomes here, understanding full well that none of that is guaranteed in any fashion, and there's significant differences and significant conditions that could happen and make any analysis totally worthless. But we do have tools to at least imagine possible futures and imagine possible outcomes, and I think that's our role, is to explain why we think those are possible outcomes based on what happened in the past.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue into this next question. because during our first discussion, we actually started off with this question of what history can teach us. And you made it very clear right at the start that, history can't predict the future, but it can inform us of possible outcomes, like you've just been saying. So I already forgotten the name of the guy in the story that you just talked about where they protested the vote. What was it again?
Saturninus.
Saturninus. That's what I wanted to say. I should have gone with my gut. So using that or any other comparison points in Roman history, I'm assuming that you use those to come up with a set of possible outcomes. And are there any that seem to be tracking right now?
Yeah, I think that I think the situation in Rome in the second century BC um, looks from a general perspective like what we've got. And I say that not starting in 133 BC when Tiberius Gracchus starts using intimidation and then they kill him, but actually starting more in the middle part of the second century BC, where Rome has secured an empire. It's figured out a way to administer the empire without building up a bureaucracy, but instead privatizing all of the operations of that empire and selling contracts to people. And in those sales of contracts, people pay up front for the contract, and then they make a profit when they collect, say, more mine revenue than they were anticipating. Or they go to a province and they have an amount of money they're supposed to collect in taxes. They collect in excess and they make a profit. And what Romans begin to realize is that you can create a financial system around this, around this government, these government contracts and this operation of the government. It's predictable enough that you can value loans and you can create a financial system and you can create financial instruments. And so what you start getting is a group of people who understand this, who make a ton of money very quickly, and they make more money than Romans had ever seen before. And you get a tension in that system because what those people are doing is legal, but it's not good for the society. And so Cicero actually has a really good formulation for this. Cicero says that, for a society to function, there has to be both a commitment to law, but also a commitment to the common good. And the tension that you have in the second century is the commitment to law says those people should keep their property. The commitment to common good says that money should be distributed more equitably. And in a representative democracy, how do you make a choice to take somebody's property that they own legally? These people did not do anything wrong. Well, they didn't do anything illegal. And how do you take their property when they haven't broken the law, but it's not good for the society to have that much property? And the Republic can't figure it out. And so what you ultimately get is a generation later, people start saying, this isn't working for me. There's a problem here. What is good for society is not being done by the government, and we're frustrated. And that's when violence and intimidation starts creeping in. Once people get frustrated with the society's systems not working in the way they're supposed to, then this anger and this frustration and this willingness to use not legal, not tolerated methods to try to get something done, that starts creeping in. And I think in our society, we have seen that frustration growing over the last 10 years. I mean, I think back to Occupy Wall Street.
Yeah, I was just
It's a
thinking about that.
totally
Yeah.
peaceful, basically protest movement saying something is really wrong here. But it didn't change. It didn't make the difference. It didn't get to the point where we could bridge that gap between what's legal and what's right. And Romans didn't figure out how to do that. And that was a tremendous failing that led to this alternative way of doing politics that involved intimidation and violence because the normal process wasn't working. And so for me, that's the story that really resonates to me. And there is the dialogue, the text where Cicero actually lays out this idea is a text called The Republic. And he writes it much later, but he sets it in just after the murder of Tiberius Gracchus in 133. And his idea there is we could have saved it. We could have saved the Republic. And it's a dialogue that has the leading figures of that moment in a room talking about what you could do to make the Republic work. And I have felt for a long time like that's the moment we're at, right? Like we're at that moment where you could have that Ciceronian dialogue. And what Cicero says in the introduction to it is this is the moment when it could have gone differently. And the lead character in this is a man named Scipio Aemilianus who dies not long after the dramatic date of that dialogue. And Cicero's point was he could have saved it. He could have saved it. And he just dies. Maybe he was poisoned. Maybe he just was sick. It's hard to say. But Cicero's like, that was our chance and we lost it. And now look where we are. And that's the moment I feel like we're at. I think we do have a chance. We do have the Scipio Aemilianus moment. We do have that chance to say there is a path forward where we can do what's both legal and right. But we don't have a big window to do that. It's not like it's going to last 100 years.
Yeah.
We have to figure it out. And that was my immediate reaction to January 6th is like, this is our Scipio Aemilianus moment. Like we could do this, but we have to do it. We have to commit to doing it. We have to commit to fixing these issues in a way that affirms who we are as a people.
Yeah.
And that's the third part of what Cicero was saying, right? A republic is the property of a community of citizens who are joined together by a common understanding of what is lawful and what is good for everyone. I think that's still our republic, but kind of only just barely. We don't have a lot of time before those conditions degenerate to the point where they don't come back.
We saw, if the past year has taught us anything, it's that people are frustrated. People are very frustrated. And, whatever you think about Black Lives Matter or the rioters, you can't deny the fact that people feel taken advantage of in some way. And there's a lot of latent anger. When you say the problem needs to be fixed, and you mentioned Occupy Wall Street and doing what's right for everyone, are you kind of alluding to the accumulation of wealth of the most rich people in the U.S. versus everyone else?
I think that's a huge problem. And I think that's a huge problem because it's the same problem the Romans were confronting. We have a system that says that wealth was acquired legally, but it's definitely not good for people. It's definitely not good for our society for that amount of wealth to be concentrated in the way that it is. And I think everybody understands that. But then it's a question of how do you get to a compromised position where everybody can agree that this is a good path forward? And this is why I'm both kind of heartened and disappointed in what I'm seeing from Biden. I think we're having that conversation, but I don't think we're having it in the right way. I think that the way that to get to that Scipio Aemilianus moment, what needs to happen is you need to not only say this is what we're doing, but you need to get everybody to agree to do it. And it's possible that we might be in a situation where people just are unwilling to agree to do it, and that's tragic. But I think what Biden is saying right now is a little dangerous, where he's saying no Republicans are voting for this, but the general populace supports me, so therefore it's bipartisan, therefore it's a common position, therefore it's a compromise, and there's consensus about it. But our system doesn't work that way, right? Our system doesn't work on straight democracy, straight popular votes. It works on representatives. And it's possible you can't actually get to the point where you get Republicans to sign on to this. But saying it doesn't matter if they sign on to this is, I think, not true to what our system is supposed to be. And it's a kind of dangerous step to be taking.
Sign on to
So
this. What specifically are you referring to?
I'm thinking right now, I mean, because we're talking April 14th, I'm talking about the infrastructure package
Oh, gotcha. Yep.
where Biden is saying, well, yeah, okay, there aren't Republicans that are going to vote for it, but there's, Republicans in the populace who are supportive of this. There's a majority of people that are supportive of this. And a lot of them are not Democrats. And therefore, well, it's bipartisan anyway.
Right.
Um, and I think the danger there is that's not actually how our system is supposed to work. And so we are at a point where we're thinking about, does the outcome justify the way we get to it? Um, that's the kind of conversation that Romans were having in 133 BC. It is Tiberius Gracchus is proposing 133 BC proposes land reform to try to address economic inequality. And I think people would agree that that's a reasonable policy that he's pursuing. But the way he does it is not the way the system is supposed to work. He uses force, he uses intimidation to get that through. And so Romans had to ask, well, we like the outcome, but we don't like the way we get there. Is that okay?
Yeah. This reminds me of I think we touched on this maybe a little bit in the last conversation where we were talking about executive order and a leader doing what the people know needs to be done, but not going through the channels that have been set up to ensure collaboration, compromise, and instead just, iron fisting it through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we're seeing a different version of that right now. But it's that same tension.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that there's some things that give you hope. He's doing something right that is giving you a glimmer of hope. What do you recognize in Biden as being potentially healing or at least positive for the moment we're in?
I mean, one of the things that I've been particularly interested in thinking about Biden is actually the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, which I think will strike everybody as weird, given that Biden doesn't seem a particularly deep thinker, and he's definitely not the most sophisticated person in articulating why he's doing what he's doing. But what Marcus Aurelius was able to do is, in some ways, really incredible, because Marcus Aurelius is reigning over the Roman Empire during a time of plague. I mean, during the time when smallpox hits the Roman Empire for the first time, probably 10% of the population dies of smallpox. There's huge amounts of economic consequences. The state basically can't field armies for a couple of years because it's hit so badly by smallpox. And so you're in a moment of crisis where it's totally possible to just turn on people, to blame other people for this, to have society break down. And what our historians from the period who lived under Marcus Aurelius say is that Marcus looks at everybody holistically, and he understands what they can do well. He understands what they can do poorly. He values what they do well, and he doesn't worry about what they do poorly. And he brings society together because he affirms everyone's achievements by directing things to them that he knows they can do. And he doesn't hold against them what they can't do. And so Romans come together in this really, really difficult moment, and they rebuild their society. And they do it because they have an emperor who identifies what they're capable of, not what they can't do, what they're failing to do, what they do poorly, but what they do well. And he gives them more tasks that are consistent with what they do well, and he praises them for doing them well. And so he brings society together in a fashion that doesn't emphasize the negative. It doesn't make people resent each other. It doesn't make people focus on the failures of others. Instead, it makes them focus on the things that they are able to do and makes them feel good about contributing to the resilience of that society. And for years when I read this in historians, I thought that this was just crap, right? I thought that this was just like historians sort of blowing smoke into the air about Marcus Aurelius, this great emperor. But then you read Marcus, and Marcus says that's what he's doing. You read his meditations, and he says that's how I view other people. Biden is not Marcus Aurelius, But I think the way that he's approaching the response to the pandemic is this, it's moving in this direction of affirming the positives, not emphasizing the negatives, but affirming what's being done right, who's doing it, how we recover together, how we find common ground to affirm our strengths instead of emphasizing our weaknesses and our failings. I don't know that that's enough to fix all of the problems that we have in how we think about each other and how we talk about each other, but it worked in the second century, and it worked because what it consistently did is it made people feel good about their contributions. It made people feel invested in the success of the society as it recovered from trauma. Um, it's a positive way that we can move forward. And I see signs that in the pandemic response, this is how this administration is working. And I think that's going to ultimately be the biggest story of the next year. If we can keep focusing on what we're doing well and focusing on how everybody is contributing to it, that's going to go a long way in healing some of the divisions, because we all now can focus on a success, and we all now can focus on the role that we played in that success. And so that is one thing I think is encouraging.
It's interesting that you are lauding the Biden administration for their handling of the coronavirus in the past few months. I'll be straight up. I turned down my level of consumption of news after the election, after January 20th. But the Democrats made promises on the campaign trail that they didn't keep to. The one that really comes to mind is telling voters in Georgia that if we win these seats, you're going to have checks in February, and it took another, month and a half for that to materialize. Is there any indication if Marcus Aurelius, was he what he says is what he does kind of guy? Was it easier back then to stick to your word? Was he just a more character driven person?
Yeah, I think that one of the challenges in trying to bridge the gap from an autocratic system, which is what Marcus is in charge of. I mean, it's an autocratic system that he didn't lord over people, but it was an autocratic system, and he had that job for life. You're more careful about how you do things, because when you're running for election, you of course say all kinds of things to create the vision of a future that's going to dawn immediately. And an electoral system encourages that, because what you're doing ultimately is you're selling hope. You're selling optimism. I mean, not always, but what Biden was doing was selling hope and optimism. With Marcus, it's a more calibrated thing, because Marcus was actually chosen to be emperor, not by the emperor who preceded him, though he was perfectly happy to have Marcus do it, but by the emperor before the emperor who preceded him. I mean, Marcus was so exceptional that the Emperor Hadrian said, Antoninus Pius is going to be my successor, and Marcus Aurelius is going to be Antoninus's successor. And Marcus is like, a teenager, early 20s when this is decided. He's so exceptional that he was recognized as exceptional for a long time. And so Marcus doesn't have the obligation to promise anything.
Right.
And so he can play a different game because he's there for life. He can play a longer game where he can, in essence, say, we are going to solve this problem and it's going to take time, but I'm going to be there to see it through to the end. And I'm going to get credit for solving it whenever it's solved.
Right. He's not playing it safe, waiting for his second term. He's just doing the things that he wants to do, or that he thinks need done right away.
Because the job is his until he dies. And so that means, in essence, also a Roman emperor, dumb Roman emperors would do stupid things, but good Roman emperors would understand that you don't want to cut taxes and increase spending and produce a kind of sugar rush economic boom, because you're still around when the crash comes. It doesn't make sense for you to do that. Because if you're popular in year one, but you're unpopular in year five, year one didn't help you. You're going to die in year five if you cause too many problems, even if year one was good.
Yeah, and people
The
have
perfect,
recency bias or whatever, right? They remember the most recent version of the, or most recent, they judge the whole thing by the most recent experience with that thing, right?
yeah, yeah. And so, so for an emperor, you really are, I mean, the advantage of that system is with a good ruler, you can really move in a very deliberate way to address whatever problems you're seeing. The disadvantage is you don't always have a good ruler. and,
Right.
and then you get
Yeah.
all kinds of terrible stuff happening, and there's no check on that because the only way to get rid of that person is to kill them.
Man, Marcus Aurelius was sounding really good. While we were talking, I was like, man, would I rather have 100 years of Marcus Aurelius dic- dictatorship or keep the system going as it is? And I don't know. I mean, I'm going to be dead before 100 years is over. So maybe.
Yeah, and that's the fundamental choice that Romans were faced with. Was a republic with all of its dysfunction preferable to, in essence, the like rolling of the dice with an emperor? I'm trying
You
to
would pick the
remember.
Republic. Yeah. You would pick the Republic.
I would pick the republic because there's so many instances of an emperor going bad, and for unpredictable reasons. Like Caligula starts out actually okay. And then it seems like he gets sick or something happens and he is not okay anymore. But you can't get rid of him. You can't 25th Amendment him. You can't like retire him. You can't vote him out of office. And then the tragedies just compound because he does all sorts of horrible things to people. And then he gets killed. I mean, a political system shouldn't depend on somebody getting killed if they can't do their job.
Yeah.
Um, so that's why I think that it's a really seductive choice to say, well, yeah, I mean, they got Marcus Aurelius for almost 20 years, and before that, they had Antoninus Pius for another 24 years, and even Hadrian. For a lot of people, Hadrian was a really good emperor. I mean, you have a whole lifetime of really good government, but then you also have the possibility of Caligula, or the possibility of Commodus, or the possibility of Nero. And is it worth it? And it can change on a dime. Marcus Aurelius's son ended up being a terrible emperor. Um, and so you can have it literally shift like overnight from a great emperor to somebody who is just not capable of doing the job. And that's not a job, if you're not capable of doing it, where you're going to get a good outcome.
When I was thinking about how you might think about these events and draw from history to project possible outcomes of the current event, there's over 2,000 years from the fall of the Roman Republic up till now, over 2,000 years, right? 2,050
Yeah.
or so. And a whole lot of technology. Like we have social media, which was played at least a role in what happened on January 6th. How do you factor these in or adjust your projections, knowing what we have and they don't, and what they have and we don't? How does that kind of imbalance weigh on your outcome set?
Yeah, I think that the real challenge with technology is one of scale. It's not about communication speed, because what we see, the best example of this is something that happened in the aftermath of the assassination of Caesar, where over the 5 days, Caesar was assassinated on March 15th of 44 BC, and over the next 5 days, you have intense maneuverings in the city of Rome to try to shape popular opinion, and popular opinion bounces back and forth between the murder of Caesar was a liberation, to the murder of Caesar was a horrible betrayal, to the murder of Caesar was frankly bad for Rome. And various people are able to shape those popular beliefs because they understand how to command the communication technologies of the day. And so events and perspectives can change really quickly in Rome. But the question really that's different is scale, because that's happening in a city. It's happening in a human space. It's happening where news of these things spreads by word of mouth. And it can spread very quickly because you're in a small space. There's a lot of people in that space. I mean, there's 1 million people in the city of Rome. And so it's not like it's 5 people making decisions. It's really news being disseminated and ideas being amplified in a pretty big community of people, and quickly. But if you're in Egypt, or you're in Syria, or you're in Spain, the decision about what Caesar's murder meant is already made in Rome before you know he was even killed. And that's what's different, right? That's what's different about our space is social media, and our media in general disseminates information much more quickly. And so these conversations get, in a way, amplified in a fashion that is not personal. And it isn't involving the direct interaction of people. And so what that means is, of course, there's filters that come into how that information is disseminated, while that information is disseminated much more widely and much more quickly. And I don't know that I have a good answer for how we correct for that. I think the mistake is to say, and then I hear this a lot, the mistake is to say, well, things move more slowly in Rome. They didn't move more slowly in Rome. It's just the scale of how those things are developing is much smaller, right? It's in a physical space that is much smaller than the physical space where things happen here, because our communication technology means that these conversations can happen nationally instead of within a city.
Right. So today we have this thing going on where there's so many people giving their opinions. There's, you go on Twitter and you can hit 30 opinions with a rock. And people get trapped in echo chambers listening to, there's so many opinions out there. You start to gravitate to those voices that seem to most align with your pre-existing beliefs. Did something like that exist in Rome at all? Were there people who were, I don't know, propaganda voices of certain segments of the population or political affiliations?
So I think this is a really good question that that ancient historians need to explore more. I can give you examples of this later in Roman history.
Okay. How much
There's
later?
like in the 4th century AD.
Okay.
We do have, I think the best example of this is during a time of pagan Christian conflict in Egypt. We know in monasteries there are people who are being mobilized to take actions, because what you have is the creation of what I think sociologists call totalizing discourse. Right, you're in a space, and the conversation is completely controlled by the people who manage that space. And so you can mobilize people to act in a specific way simply because you are dominating their access to information. And so all of their information, because they live in a monastery that is physically distinct and hierarchical, you can control what's being said, what's being understood, and what kind of actions are being taken as a result of that. Again, it's a physical space, so it's different from what we're talking about now. But we do have examples like that in Roman history where people get mobilized to do things because they have been radicalized by a particular space in which they live and the way ideas are being presented in that space. And so in a monastery, someone will present an idea saying that the bishop is being attacked by opponents. And we as monks need to go and defend our bishop. It's our obligation. And you basically can create conditions where the conversation in that monastery is controlled. The actions that the people take in response to that are also basically directed. And they go out and into a society that doesn't really understand where they're coming from and why they're behaving in the way they are. I don't have examples of that from the Roman Republic. And I think that's something where historians really, because this phenomenon and its implications are so new, this phenomenon of echo chambers and ideological echo chambers created by social media is so new. Historians haven't gone back and said, well, what examples do we have of this from the past where we can say, look, yeah, this happened before. Not in this way necessarily, but something like it happened before. Let's think with it. Let's see where we get to. Let's see what its limits are. Let's see if it helps us understand this situation we're in now better. Um, so I think we need to do more work on that. We as historians need to do more work on that because I don't have a good example for you from the Republic that speaks to this. But I can give you examples from other parts of Roman history where you do actually see things like this.
But they were very clearly in the Republic. There was factions. I mean, there wasn't your typical political party, right? It was just more so people aligned behind a Gracchus or Saturninus.
Saturninus, yeah.
Saturninus, right? So you have these kind of factions of thought or maybe status that support one another, and it's reasonable to assume that they would have some sort of public-facing propaganda arm or something to, like you said, radicalize or convert people to their beliefs.
Yeah, I think that it's possible. I don't want to, because I haven't looked at it. I don't want to say that I think we can go all the way there. There are places in the Republic where I think what you've described maybe are there. There are followers of a guy named Clodius, who is a really radical politician who uses street violence regularly in the 50s BC. They could well have created a community like that. I don't know. I haven't seen any evidence for it, but it wouldn't surprise me to see that there was this kind of totalizing discourse, an echo chamber, and radicalization of people through socializing them into a movement or into a group that was dedicated to this kind of action. I think it's certainly possible, but I think that we as historians need to figure out how to answer that question better. And I don't think we're there. And I think it's unfortunate because I think there's something that we could say if we could do it. But I don't actually know what that answer is right now. So I think it's a great question. And it's definitely a sign of more work that we need to do.
Yeah. Well, I think you're doing great work, Dr. Watts. I love talking with you. It's always a good time for me. All right, we have about 10 minutes left. There was, I don't know, 10 questions we didn't get to that I wanted to talk about. So I talked to you offline before we hopped on and mentioned that facial recognition and vaccine passports were two things I wanted to talk about potentially because whenever we chatted last October, one of the things that stuck with me and it was kind of a bug in my ear for a few weeks after was, I think you said something like, because of the increase in political violence, Romans were more willing to have their rights or freedoms reduced, taken away for the sake of being more safe. And so I think the reason I want to talk about COVID, vaccine passports, obviously that's a play that is being proposed under the banner of safety and beating the virus. There's also a potential dark side to it. We know our country has a history of collecting data of otherwise innocent citizens. And then the facial recognition, it's not in every city. There's cities that have banned its use by law enforcement, but the potential for it to be used in law enforcement, I mean, it's there. There's a lawsuit going on in Michigan about this right now, actually. But I think I'll just jump to my final question, which kind of combines these things, and we can just end on this.
Yeah.
So the question is, have we already passed the point where our republic has fallen, but we just don't realize it yet because the way in which it has fallen is completely unique to history? And so I'll just give like the four thoughts that were informing this question. The first is that the world is way more technologically advanced than the Romans, almost to an unrecognizable extent, right? So that's point one. The second point is that before the internet, law and order was enforced really by a state monopoly on violence. So the state said, if you commit violence, we will commit violence against you. So that deters people from being violent. But now today we live in the age of internet. That violence as a deterrent is reactive, right? People are committing a crime, you're reacting. We now live in this age where information can be used to be proactive, where now it's not, oh, you did this wrong, we're going to put you in jail or, whatever. It's now getting to the point where, I don't know, I can envision it's like Die Hard versus Minority Report kind of thing. And then the twist to that though, is that those information databases are not under government control. They're under the control of unelected CEOs of big tech companies who, Facebook is the number one corporate lobbyist in the US right now. So put all those together, and my question is, has the republic already fallen? And just because of these unique factors, the fact that the power is shifting to tech companies and CEOs makes it impossible for us to find an analog in history to recognize right now that we're already past the tipping point.
So I agree that these concerns are really significant. And I agree that these concerns these things that you bring up all have the potential to really do all sorts of things to the rights of individuals and their relationship with the government. And I also completely agree. I mean, the Roman state did not have surveillance technology. It didn't really even have police forces. And so it was a society that was based on a different kind of way of managing its populations. But I think that what's interesting and what's kind of similar is the standard that Romans would set for the fall of their republic is one that I think is still useful because it gives us some guardrails that we need to make sure are enforced. And what Romans would say, and this is a composite of a number of different ideas, but what Romans would say is, first of all, the state has to belong to the people. The people have to have a consent in how it is making its decisions. They have to agree about what's lawful and what's good for everyone. And they also have to have a right to legal appeal to anything that the state is doing against them or their property. And so fundamentally, I think what Romans would say is, you as a citizen of a republic are a part owner of this entity. You have a say in how it works. It responds to what you're saying, and it does not have the power to take away your life, your property, or your rights unless the rest of the corporation agrees to this. And I think that's an important principle that can help us think through the kinds of basically guardrails we need to set for how all of these operations of technology and other things in our society are working. If we come to a place where people's rights are being taken away from them and they do not have the right to appeal this, they do not have the right to check with the larger collective parts of our republic, I think every Roman would say that is not a republic anymore. And this is one of the biggest fights that Romans have repeatedly. And there's a moment in 63 BC where there is a conspiracy that's uncovered, and it's a real conspiracy, but it is uncovered in a way through kind of informers and information being spread, and it's real. It's not made up. But in the Senate, there's an argument about what do we do in response to this. And Julius Caesar comes up and he says, "Look, you can't execute people without trial. You can't." Because where does that start? If these people are bad and you execute them without trial, maybe in the minute that's right, but it doesn't stop with bad people. And you've now taken away this principle that every person who's part of this republic needs to be respected as part of this republic. The republic needs to be sure when it's taking action against them that it actually is the right thing to do and that everyone agrees to it. And so I think that might be a principle that we start with, right? We are all stakeholders in this state. our rights need to be respected. That means you don't just shoot someone randomly when you have a traffic stop. But it also means that you don't take their property away. It means that you don't take their rights away. It means that every kind of step that involves disenfranchising someone who's an owner of this corporation, this collective entity that is our republic, those rights need to be respected equally for everyone. And it has to be a collective process, of due process, to be sure that what you're doing to someone else is consistent with that principle of everyone being equal under the law and everybody having a consent and a voice in how those laws are determined and how decisions about the common good are determined. And the failing in the Republic was that in Rome, the Republic could no longer guarantee those things. Fundamentally, the reason that Romans are willing to go with Augustus instead of trying to rebuild the Republic is they don't feel that the Republic can protect their rights anymore. They don't feel like that citizen corporation exists anymore. And so I think if we're working on the level of abstractions, to say that our Republic has fallen already, I think is premature because those conditions still are there. But we really do need to understand that that's what our Republic is, right? It's this compact that says that all citizens own it. Nobody else personally owns our Republic. We all own it. And therefore we have obligations to it, but it has rights, or it has obligations to observe our rights as owners of this collective entity. And if we start from that principle, we can start saying things like, Facebook can't own us. The Republic has to protect us equally. The Republic can't say that certain people are, better owners than others, or more willing, more likely, or more liable to have a voice in how things are decided. Those are the principles that we need to uphold, because that's kind of fundamentally what we are. And the Republic stops being that when it stops respecting the rights of all of its citizens equally, when it stops being a consensual form of government, when it stops being something where all of the people in it really do feel like they are owners of it and their rights are going to be respected. And they have a right of appeal to the larger group so that people can say that's messed up, right? That can't happen. This person was done wrong by our society and we need to fix it. And what Caesar says is, if you kill somebody without giving them that right, there's no possibility of fixing it. And we've then broken the compact. We've then broken the arrangement. We've then broken the promise that our Republic makes to all of its citizens. And those are really powerful sentiments. And I think we need to understand those sentiments. I think that there's a lot about Caesar that one can object to, but I don't think that's an idea we should object to.
Yeah. That seems like a good place to call it. I think we were getting close to the ground of the eternal decline and fall of Rome. It sounded like we're getting close to that dialogue, working with one another, the collaborative spirits, and knowing that we're all in this together. And that, I think we'll pick this back up in a few months.
I look forward to that. That would be great.
Likewise, Dr. Watts. I really appreciate your time. It's always a pleasure getting to speak to you, and I look forward to reading the upcoming book and having you back on.
Sounds great. I look forward to it too. Thanks a lot, Eric.